When I was teaching high school, Sunday school years ago, I always used to put a timeline on the bottom of the board for the kids, and they'd tease me mercilessly, and it got to be our thing. And we had a lot of fun with it, but they acknowledged it was really helpful in understanding the Bible because the Christian scriptures in the Bible are not in the Bible chronologically. They're in the Bible thematically. So the Gospels come first because they tell the story of Jesus. Then Acts come because that's the history of the early church. Then we have the letters of Paul and the pastoral letters beyond that. And then we have the book of Revelation. But they were not written in that order. They were written in a very specific order. We got into this a little bit when we were talking about why Jesus was Hebrew and not Jewish, because timelines do influence how we see things. So if we work on the assumption that is year 100 CE, and this is year 1, Jesus' ministry was in this part of time up to about 30, 35. Paul didn't start writing his letters until about the year 50. And Paul's letter to the Romans was the last letter he wrote. But again, if you look in the Bible, it's the first letter shown because it seemed to be the richest, the greatest letter of the lot of them. The first Gospels were not written until 60 or 70, and that was Mark. I should put Paul over here. Mark came first. Matthew was next. Then came Luke. And then John around 100. Now, the pastorals are sort of in here. So that's Peter's, the Johns, even the Hebrews. We call them pastorals because they are meant to shed a little more light on the community of the early church and how we are to be community together, whereas Paul actually got into theology. The other thing, the last book is Revelation. And Revelation is an interesting book to read. I'm not sure if I'm spelling that correctly. Revelation was written sometime between 65 and 90, most scholars figure. So it was written around the same time the Gospels were written. So John of Patmos, who wrote Revelation, who claims to have written Revelation, would not have been aware of the Gospels. So this is the real thing with timelines. It's not only about the order of the Bible and the scriptures that are there, it's also about who had what information. See, Paul, he didn't have the Gospels available to him. None of them had Acts, which was written around here around the same time as John was written. Matthew and Luke both had advantage of Mark, but Mark did not have advantage of them. And there are other letters that have not made it into the Gospels and other books that were written around this time as well. But they were not necessarily known to the early writers. So we cannot start reading, say, something in Luke and assume that this is something that Paul would have had at his hands when he went to open his churches. When Paul started the Christian message, he was only working with Hebrew scripture. He had nothing of the Christians to work with. And that's why it's important to remember that when you look at the Bible and feel that some books just quite aren't getting to the full wealth of what you assume you're going to find, for instance, in the book of John. John had 100 years of Christianity before he started to put things down. Oh, and just as an aside, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're just assigned names by the early church. There is no authorship in any of these. We have no idea. All of the books are actually anonymous. The only parts of the scripture that Christian scripture that have any identifying marks are Paul's letters and potentially Revelation, who was John of Patmos, but even that's in question.